Okay. Go ahead.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. We're going to pick up where we left off last time with our lectures on the reign of quantity and the signs of the times by Ghani Geno Abdul Wahid Yahya rahimahullah. The previous chapter concerned mechanism and materialism, and Geno argues in that chapter that the modern materialism that we see around us today
Hang on.
is...
Start over.
Okay.
Let me put that there.
Starting again from the very beginning? From the top? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Just speak loud. Boom. Go.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وبعد. Continuing our lectures on the reign of quantity and the signs of the times by Ghani Geno Sheikh Abdul Wahid Yahya. Last time we concluded our discussion of chapter 14 on mechanism and materialism, which itself is a direct outgrowth of the previous chapter, chapter 13, the postulates of rationalism. Now, Genon considers all of these things to be intimately related and, in fact, to be the direct consequences of the deviations introduced into philosophy by another René Descartes. And so for Guénon, materialism as we find it in the modern world today is a direct result, a direct genetic development, we could say, of the philosophy of Descartes. And this widespread materialism, which is the default setting, you could say, of the vast majority of the denizens of the modern age, is something which Guénon called, towards the end of chapter 14, factual materialism. In other words, the influence of materialism extending throughout the society and affecting almost every single person, whether they realize it or not, inasmuch as this factual materialism is not an avowed and formal materialism, but just an embodiment of the general manner of thinking of most people. And this then leads into this notion that Guénon introduces in chapter 15, entitled and known as the illusion of ordinary life. Guénon means by this the illusion, the mistake, the mistaken understanding that human existence is purely material. Let us see how he begins this chapter. He says, the opening sentence on page 101. The materialistic attitude, whether it be a question of explicit and formal materialism, or of a simple practical materialism, what he called functional materialism at the end of chapter 14, necessarily imposes on the whole psychophysiological constitution of the human being. Interesting, he says psychophysiological. In other words, both the soul and the body, the entire soul-body or psychosomatic complex, the psychophysical constitution of the human being, a real and very important modification. This is easily understood, and in fact it is only necessary to look round in order to conclude that modern man has become quite impermeable to any influences other than such as impinge on his senses. Not only have his faculties of comprehension become more and more limited, but also the field of his perception has become correspondingly restricted. Very nice, very well said. The result, continues Guénon, is a sort of reinforcement of the profane point of view, For this point of view was first born of a defect of comprehension, and thus of a limitation, and this limitation, as it becomes accentuated and extends to all domains, itself seems to justify the point of view, at least in the eyes of those who are affected by it. In other words, it propagates itself. It becomes, if you like, a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this kind of vacuous nature of people, such that they are convinced that there is nothing supra-individual, nothing supra-human, nothing supra-mundane, and that the entirety of life, the entirety of human existence is material and thus limited to the res extensa, and thus limited to only that which is perceivable by the senses. In another context, and I've said this many times in this series and indeed in other videos, in another context, another French thinker much later, Jacques Ellul, in his book, The Technological Society, as well as in another book, Propaganda, but he uses this phrase in somewhere in the Technological Society. I think in one of the first videos on this series, I mentioned it. So I don't have the reference here at the moment. Well, is it there? I don't know if I have it marked in the book, but I simply want to say that he calls this, and as I said in a different context, he calls this the systematic vacuity of the individual. Yeah, so these are the books in question. This is The Technological Society by Jacques Ellul, and this is his book on propaganda. So there's a post-it note here. Maybe I marked the relevant page. Let's see if indeed that is the case. And if it is, I'll read the passage to you. He's talking about the conditioning of people's thought through propaganda, which he talks about in much more detail in this book. But this is towards the end of the Technological Society on pages 370 and 371. He talks about the manipulability of the masses. Mind you, this is before the internet, before the World Wide Web, before apps, before TikTok, before the spread of mobile phones to almost every person on the planet. So he talks about the manipulability of the masses. And he's arguing here, citing another thinker named Monero, that propaganda technique has for its object the production and cultivation among the masses of certain predispositions, and a special facility for doing it at a given moment, whatever is strategically opportune. For doing at a given moment whatever is strategically opportune. As political circumstances change, it is necessary at intervals to cultivate successive predispositions. So right now, the predisposition which is being created in the United States is that there needs to be a war with Iran in order to protect a certain criminal enterprise that has been in operation for 75 years in the Middle East. He says this is a remarkable notion. The use of certain propaganda techniques is not meant to entail immediate and definitive adhesion to a given formula, but rather to bring about a kind of long-range vacuity of the individual. So this long-range vacuity of the individual, which Jacques Ellul speaks of in the context of the modern technological society, he's speaking perhaps in a more political, in a more economic, in a more, shall we say, policy-oriented context. But this kind of a long-range vacuity and emptiness of the individual is also something which, again, I think is talking about here in terms of the spiritual dimension. Mm-hmm. The spread of materialism and making that into a kind of default setting on human beings so that they deny the possibility of anything supramundane. I have my own phrase for this. I call this the obduracy of the individual, from the word obdurate. An obdurate meaning hardened, in wrongdoing or wickedness or stubbornly impenitent. And this is indeed how you find people today. They are obdurate when it comes to the spiritual dimension and the spiritual realm, and even the notion of the existence of God. The most striking example of such obdurate twits in our time is Dawkins and, of course, others. And most of these people they're all dying off now. There was also Christopher Hitchens. He, of course, now has also gone on to meet his maker. He can argue atheism with God himself now. Daniel Dennett. I think Dennett is dead too, isn't he?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. Anyway, he'll die. We'll all die at some point. What's that other chap?
Sam Harris.
Sam Harris, an extremely obnoxious man. There's another one. There's Victor Stegner. He's a physicist. There's, of course, the native informant Ayaan Hirsa Ali as well, who is supposed to be such a great rationalist, and all of a sudden, of course, then she decided recently that she's become a Christian. So anyway, not to get off the point, we're getting off the point. So I call this the obduracy of the individual. And it is thus that we get a certain deviant notion of ordinary life, quote unquote. And this is indeed a deviant notion. This indeed is rightly termed by Guénon to be an illusion. He says, thus arises the idea of what is commonly called ordinary life or everyday life. This is in fact understood to mean, above all, a life in which nothing that is not purely human can intervene in any way, owing to the elimination from it of any sacred, ritual, or symbolical character. It means little whether this character be thought of as specifically religious or as conforming to some other traditional modality, because the relevant point in all cases is the effective action of spiritual influences. The very words ordinary or everyday, moreover, implying that everything that surpasses conceptions of that order is, even when it has not been expressly denied, at least relegated to an extraordinary domain, regarded as exceptional, strange, and unaccustomed. This is in complete and total marked contrast to traditional societies and traditional people, in which what we may call the profane point of view simply does not exist. In fact, there is really no such thing as a profane domain, strictly speaking, but only a profane point of view, as Guénon says further down on page 102. So this idea of everyday life reduces everything to the sensible order. It's completely in contrast to the traditional worldview. You read, look at a book like the Tazkiratul Awliya of Fariduddin Attar. I think A.J. Arbery translated a good bit of that. The great Orientalist A.J. Arbery translated a good bit of this book as the Memorials of the Saints. These are accounts of Muslim Sufi saints, how they lived, various sort of biographical, modern people would say fantastic sort of hagiography or hagiography. Hagiography is holy biography, I suppose. But the objectionable thing from the modern point of view is all these miracles and so forth. I mean, does this really happen? They consider all this just to be fiction, that this isn't true, because of their obduracy. Their souls have become so opaque that they have completely cut themselves off from that domain, from that dimension, so that they cannot even conceive of spiritual influences. If the entire animate order, all living things, including human beings, are just Cartesian machines, and there is no soul, and you have Cartesian dualism, and you have this whole mind-body problem, and it's just all matter in motion, as the Newtonian world machine, as they call it. And even with the modifications of Einstein, the physics of Einstein, general and special relativity, it's still a world which is completely devoid of any spiritual dimension. That's a very bizarre way of thinking if you view it against the entire backdrop of human history. And of course the moderns are convinced that, they've gone beyond all of this and they're so advanced and there has been a progressive sort of amelioration of the human condition in all realms and advancement in all areas, and that modern people are far in advance of ancient people and even people from even 100 years ago, because they do not have these hang-ups. So this is a very different way, a completely unprecedented in human history of looking at things. And they just don't realize it. I mean, as I said, and as Genon says, there really is no such thing as a profane realm or dimension. There is only a profane point of view. It is true, however, I think, having lived in both areas of the world, that in the West, things are a bit more solidified. Now, this is another area, this is another term, which Genon introduces in 1516, chapter 17, called the solidification of the world, a direct sort of result of this materialism. But I think that this kind of solidification is more pronounced in the Western world, simply because there are very few sort of sacred spaces, truly sacred spaces. In a traditional Muslim city like Fas in Morocco, or Fez if you prefer, Marrakesh, Marrakesh, Cairo, Damascus, Delhi, Lahore, Istanbul, there are all sorts of very old sacred buildings. Despite secularization in the modern world, Muslims, there are, in these major metropolises of the Muslim world that I mentioned, people do pray 5 times a day. A significant number of them do. There are masajid, there are mosques, you hear the adhan. And I'm talking about the Islamic world because that's the one I know the best. But you find this dimension. And you find all of these Sufi tombs, or turbe as they're called in Turkish, or maqamat, or maraqid awliya. There are different terms in Arabic and other Muslim, but basically places where great spiritual figures are buried, and whose sites are a locus of constant devotion and visitation by people. You find this also, of course, in the most important sacred sites of the Islamic world, namely Mecca, Medina, and of course Al-Quds, which is currently under occupation. So this is a completely different realm. I was privileged enough to live in many of these, in some of the places which I have named, and it was not like life in New York City, or like so-called ordinary life at all. I remember when I was a student in Cairo, it was like actually living in Fariduddin Attar's Tazkirat al-Awliya. There were all sorts of very holy and pious people. And there's, like in Cairo in particular, is everywhere you go you hear the Quran. Someone's playing it on a cassette or on a phone or something somewhere. And in the places I used to go, there's the tombs of the head of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, Sayyidah Zainab, Sayyidah Nafisa, Sayyidah Sukaina. These are the places I would hang out. There would always be people reciting the Quran. There were always things happening. In other words, there was that spiritual influence was there. And I met many, many saintly people who were capable, or who did things which many people, modern people, would find absolutely impossible. It was many, many Sufi masters I met in Cairo, who I was privileged to know for extended periods of time. On many occasions, read my thoughts, my mind, and those of others who were present. There were situations which I observed of I don't know what it's called, Tayyul Ard, I think is the word in Arabic. Crossing vast, large areas at the blink of an eye.
Dematerializing?
No, I'll give you one example. I remember when I was a student in Cairo, this was early on, this was in the days of the elder Bush, former head of the CIA, who was also implicated in the Kennedy assassination. That's another story. The elder Mr. Bush had become president, and he was proclaiming the New World Order, and the United States was moving on Iraq at the time. And they had decided that the evil Saddam Hussein, may Allah curse him, was no longer a buddy and pal of the United States, so that they were going to go and teach him a lesson because he had gone into Kuwait. This is a while back. So this was, 1990 or so? 1991, I don't
93.
remember. No.
Before that?
Mm-mm. And at any rate, so this was all going on. And I thought it was so I was looking for someone named Sheikh Abul Majd. Now, Sheikh Abul Majd was my Quran teacher, one of my Quran teachers in the recitation of the Quran. And he was a Shafi'i scholar, graduate of Al-Azhar, and he used to lead the prayers at something called Jama al-Adawiyya, which was behind the mosque, actually, of Imam Hussein. And he was kind of a majdoob. Every now and then he had these sort of ecstatic states, and he would be in another sort of place, and he would just be talking, and people found him a bit peculiar for this reason. But he read and recited deeply from the heart. And so I was wondering, I was like, if I could only find Sheikh Abul Majd and talk to him, and then I saw him off in the distance, and so then I went to him. I was actually sitting in a cafe, and I saw him, and then I went to him, and I said, well, I'm probably going to be leaving for some weeks to the United States, right? Because this was the middle of the semester, and the so-called first Gulf War had not yet begun, but it was going to break out. So anyway, so I said to him, well, would you pray for me, and so on and so forth. He said, yes, absolutely. So he raises up his hands, and I'm looking down like this, and he's standing right in front of me, and we're looking down like this, reciting all sorts of stuff. And then he recites Al-Fatiha, and then I do this, and he's standing right in front of me, and then I look up, and he's gone. He's absolutely gone. And I look around, and I see him something like 500 meters away.
Couldn't have made it in that little time. Yeah.
And that kind of thing happened to me more than once with other people as well. The illusion of ordinary life. So you can call me a crackpot, a liar, whatever, I don't care, it happened. And these things do happen, and they can happen. But, you have to be attuned to them. If you just think, this is all a bunch of nonsense, and you just, the whole of Islam has just been reduced to outward rituals and whatnot, then yeah, then perhaps you will not have access to this room. But this kind of thing happens less in the U.S., simply because the whole environment is different. There is a certain hardening of people's hearts here, including in the religious community.
Yeah, there's something in the air, so to speak.
So to speak, yeah. A lot of these people are de facto materialists. I just saw this morning a clip, I didn't watch the whole thing, of there's some interview on some podcast called Ansari or something. Interviewing the illustrious Salafi Nasibi scholar, quote unquote, Yasir Qadi.
Sheikh Doctor.
Excuse you. Yeah. In which he's known for this, but he talks about how he is in favor of evolution. Yeah. Darwinian evolution. Of course, he says, well, it's only for animals, it's not for human beings. Go figure. I don't know how it's one, or if it's one way isn't the other. And there's another fellow in the UK who's of this view, but he says it also applies to human beings. And I can't remember his name now. I met him once. He completed the entire Dars Nizami, and later I found out he was involved with that very shady Quilliam Foundation in the UK. So you have a lot of these kind of people now in the world. So it's also interesting that a lot of modern people today, how they use the word real. They talk about real life, real things, and real really for them only again means that which is susceptible to
the five senses,
cognition by the five senses, or perception by the five senses. So-called modern philosophy has played a big role in this as well. On 103, Genon says, modern philosophy, which is more than anything else merely a systematized expression of the common mentality, subsequently reacts on the latter to a certain extent, and the two have pursued parallel courses. That of philosophy began with the Cartesian eulogy, once again Descartes, of good sense alluded to earlier. We talked about this stuff in the previous chapters, and which is very revealing in this connection. For ordinary life surely is first and foremost the domain of this so-called good sense, also called common sense. So this is another word which has been completely denuded of its original meaning. The word common sense in philosophy, originally sensus communis in traditional psychology, going back, of course, to Aristotle's De Anima, and then in people like Avicenna and others, is in Arabic called al-hiss al-mushtarak, or the sensus communis. So you have the five senses, and then you have a common sense, meaning a something other than these five senses, which is within the human being, that assimilates and organizes all of the sense perceptions that are coming in. That was what was originally called the common sense, but now it means something else. And you can thank or blame Descartes for this deviation as well. So again, just as Guénon spoke of factual materialism at the end of chapter 14, here in chapter 15, in the bottom second paragraph, which is the second, there's only two paragraphs on 1 to 3 at the very bottom of the page, he speaks of practical materialism. It may be repeated here that in most cases there is naturally in question only something that can be called a practical materialism or positivism, not dependent on any philosophical theory. For philosophical theory is now and always will be quite foreign to the majority, but this makes matters all the more serious, not only because the materialistic state of mind thereby obtains an incomparably wider diffusion, but also because it is all the more irremediable the less it is deliberate and clearly conscious. For when it becomes so, it has then really penetrated and as it were impregnated the whole nature of the individual. What he's saying is that these kind of notions have become sort of common, and they are the way that people actually act. It is the practical materialism. In other words, he means it's not a theoretical one. For most people do not theorize it. It's just the way they think and act. He says this is sufficiently shown by what has already been said about factual materialism, and he's referring to the previous chapter, and about the way in which people who nevertheless fancy themselves religious accommodate themselves to that materialism. So again, we already spoke of an example. So that he mentions that just to help the viewers, the readers of this text, in chapter 14 on page 99 and stretching over to page 100. So to some extent, Guénon is maybe repeating himself a little bit, but this is a further nuance of things. So he continues to talk about, as we stretch over into the next page on page 1, which is page 104, about the role that philosophers, or those who go by that designation in the modern world, have played. So he says, this does not mean that philosophers do not play their part just like anyone else in the modern deviation, for that would certainly be an overstatement. It only means that their part is in fact more restricted than one would be tempted to suppose at first sight, and is rather different from what it may seem to be outwardly. In quite a general way, moreover, whatever is most apparent is always, in accordance with the laws which control all manifestation, a consequence rather than a cause, an end point rather than a starting point. And in any case, it is no use searching in the apparent for whatever may be really effective, for whatever may be the really effective agent in an order more profound, whether the action in question be exercised in a normal and legitimate direction or in a directly contrary direction, as in the case now under consideration. There's a very, very, very wordy way of simply saying that people who go by the designation of philosophers in the modern world do play a very important role in the diffusion and the bringing about of this so-called practical materialism, whether they are the most fundamental cause, whether they are the seed, the fruit, the result, the cause, or all of those together in some way is what he's saying. So, you know, he speaks in very general terms. He doesn't give examples. If he did, then he would be more dated. Every now and then he does. He invokes people like Bergson and so forth. But if you were to look around today, you could see there are plenty of so-called would-be philosophers who are responsible for all sorts of deviations, such as people like Thomas Nagel. You know, there's a famous quotation of him talking about how he really, really desperately hopes that theism isn't true. Mm-hmm. It's quoted actually by Fraser in his book, The Last Superstition. You have completely individuals advancing the most deranged views, like Peter Singer at Princeton. You can just Google these people. I don't want to really go into too much detail, but he is a so-called ethicist or bioethicist who has upheld some truly odious and contemptible positions.
There's also all kinds of people. Judith Butler.
Judith Butler. But I mean,
philosopher.
Yeah, she's another one. These very demonic feminists.
Yeah.
Butler is one of them. The Frankfurt School, in its entirety, is completely demonic and satanic. And people like Theodor Adorno, people like Herbert Marcuse, and I would say even people like Leo Strauss. He's the other side. He's a kind of, I would even say there's always these false polarizations. He's kind of a controlled opposition to this sort of thing. And then, of course, now you have people with a lot of money who fancy themselves to be philosophers, crackpots like Peter Thiel and the Straussian moment. Maybe we should talk about that at some time. He's the one who's behind financing this lunatic Mr. Vance, which has been picked up by another lunatic, Mr. Trump. Yep. It's all quite just a ridiculous clown show, the modern world. Anyhow, so those are examples. People who are watching who are, of course, themselves denizens of the modern world. Many of the later names which I mentioned would not be unfamiliar to them, but you can just go and search any of these people and read about them. So the next great point, or the next really important point that Genon makes here, he moves on again to mention once again mechanism and materialism, and how the reason that they have become so influential is because of their connection with the so-called philosophical and scientific domain, and that they have been vested with a certain sort of scientific character. We already talked about this in the previous lecture, and so the point that I would really like to emphasize today is in connection with this illusory character of ordinary life, is what is called utility.
We're recording a video. Can you keep it down? Just a little bit, at least. Okay, go.
So the point which I'd really like to emphasize here, which I think is, and this is a new thing which Genon is introducing, which he hasn't talked about in the previous chapter, and that is about this concept of utility or usefulness, and how the classical, traditional, capital T, ancient, pre-modern notion of truth has been replaced with utility. He says, sorry, I lost my place. He says, this recalls once more, this is at the very bottom of 104, this recalls once more, it's the last sentence, and it stretches over to 105. Genon says, this recalls once more the idea of ordinary life, in which an effective part is played by a fairly strong dose of pragmatism. It's not an accident that pragmatism as a philosophical position is something from the modern world. And that statement is, of course, made quite independently of the fact that some of our contemporaries have tried to build up pragmatism into a philosophical system. This only became possible by reason of the utilitarian twist that is inherent in the modern profane mentality in general, and because, at the present stage of intellectual decadence, the very notion of truth has come to be completely lost to sight, so much so that the notion of utility or of convenience has ended by replacing it entirely. Now, this is a direct consequence of focusing completely on materiality. So as soon as it is agreed that reality consists exclusively in what presents itself to the senses, it is quite natural that the value attributed to any particular thing should to some extent be measured by its capacity to produce effects in the modern fashion, to produce effects in the sensible order. It is evident, moreover, that science considered in the modern fashion as being essentially grouped with industry. Today we would probably use the word technology more rather than industry here, if not more or less completely one with it, must for that reason occupy the first rank. Science, thus finding itself mingled as closely as possible with ordinary life, in which it becomes one of the principal factors, and in return the hypotheses on which it claims to be founded, however gratuitous and unjustified they may be, must themselves benefit by this privileged situation in the eyes of the people. So what Genon is saying there, and to put it in a more direct contemporary context, is that because of the tremendous success of science in the technological domain, all of these technical innovations that have come about in the modern world, that goes quite a ways to convincing people more and more of the material viewpoint and understanding of things, the illusion of ordinary life, because people think that these things are real. And when you tell them, well, you know, if you do such and such a thing, well, such and such effect will happen. So such and such spiritual activity, and they find, well, how is that possible? But if you tell them that, well, right now I can talk to any person in the world if I have a 16-digit number. That's approximate. That's a phone number. It would differ from country to country, depending on the country code and so forth. But about 15, 16 digits, right? Oh, yes, well, that's possible because of this technological device called a phone. It could be a landline. It could be a mobile phone, a cell phone. But if you say, well, if you recite these divine names, and if you write them in this way, in this particular configuration, and you replace them by these numbers, and you do this, and you perfume it in a certain way, and perform it at a certain time, then this effect will happen. They won't believe that. Even though that itself is a science. It's a scientia. It's an ilm in the real sense. And it's a technology. It's a technique. It's a techne in the real, original sense of the Greek. It's a sina'ah. It's a craft. But they won't believe you. And if you anyway, so this is this obduracy of the individual that we find today, and it's part and parcel of the illusion of ordinary life. So to conclude, I think this is a much more straightforward chapter when you see it in that light than many of the previous ones. He talks about how the materialists would be astonished to know that men have existed and still exist for whom what they call our ordinary life would be quite the most extraordinary thing imaginable. I already spoke about my own experiences living abroad, because it corresponds to nothing that occurs at all in their existence. Nevertheless, such is the case, and furthermore, these are the men who must be regarded as truly normal. While the materialists, with all their boasted good sense and all the progress of which they proudly consider themselves to be the most finished products and the most advanced representatives, are really only beings in whom certain faculties have become atrophied to the extent of being completely abolished. And this is true even of ordinary Muslims. Muslims who are not of any maybe extraordinary degree of accomplishment in the spiritual path, of being able to perform karamat and miracles and so forth. And we see how astonished and dumbfounded modern people are when they have been observing now for 10 months what has been going on in Palestine. And early on when this happened, when this began, there were many cases of people on film showing their complete and total submission and devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and their contentment with the divine decree in the face of the most difficult circumstances and the most brutal violence, which has really no precedent in the modern world, because it's been broadcast, basically live streamed, and people see this and they can't, and it doesn't compute. How is it possible? How is it possible that your house and your family and all these people just die in front of you and you say Alhamdulillah? You say all praise is due to Allah. Yes, you may weep, you may cry. Human beings are human beings. But the fact that they somehow can live another day and continue living, and that they don't resort to alcohol and drugs and all the other sort of psychotropic entertainments and diversions which you find in the modern world, which people need to get through the day. It's really something unbelievable. But this state of affairs, this condition of illusion and obduracy, cannot continue indefinitely. Because they may think that the world is a closed system, but it is not. It only appears to them as a closed system. Genon says, in the interior of which they feel themselves to be in perfect security. They are not. The modern world hangs by a thread. I said this in the very first lecture, whenever that was. It's been a long time back. It remains to be shown how this illusion can, continues Genon, in a certain sense and in a certain measure, be realized through the existence of materialism itself. But it will also appear later that this nevertheless represents, as it were, an eminently unstable state of equilibrium, and that the world has even now reached a point where the security of ordinary life, on which the whole outward organization of the modern world has rested up until now, runs serious risks of being troubled by unanticipated interferences, which he puts in quotes. There's plenty of interference going on right now. If you look at the modern world stage, plenty. Interferences aplenty. And when we say that the modern world hangs by a thread, I don't just mean its technological infrastructure, the kind that you find in the modern metropolis, its bridges, its drainage systems, its aqueducts, its sanitation, but the very oil or grease of the wheels of life, namely money. Money itself is truly, modern money is the Achilles heel of the system, because it is all based on a complete and total lie. It is based on riba. And if you remove that, the whole thing falls to pieces. But that leads us into the next chapter, which is entitled The Degeneration of Coinage, and we will touch on these matters further in our next lecture. Thank you for watching. Please do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this video as widely as you can. Thank you again for watching. Wassalamu alaikum.